regular meeting of the Newton School Committee. Hello to everyone in the committee chamber, and hello to everyone joining us from home. Putting aside a very brief meeting last week, I want to start by acknowledging and welcoming Superintendent Dr. Anna Nolan to her seat on the Newton School Committee, or to her seat in the Newton School Committee meetings. This summer, Anna has been making the rounds to many a barbecue and community gathering. And so she'll have to give us a final tally in the fall about all of that. I hope it's been fun. Before we move into public comment, I do want to acknowledge a communication that the school committee asked Anna to send to parents and guardians on our behalf last week. First, Julie McDonough, NPS's communication director, who normally sends out communications for the school committee, was on vacation, which was a slight hindrance in our ability to push out this important update. But we really wanted to get information out to parents and guardians and community members nonetheless. So, in each of the last 3 bargaining sessions that the school committee negotiations team and I had with the NTA, we each acknowledged the fact that we were what we described as stuck, with oceans between us and no clear path of coming together on the largest issue that divides us, which is compensation. Hence, the school committee initiated a process to help us move towards agreement by requesting the appointment of a state mediator, someone neutral, knowledgeable, and skilled at brokering resolutions. We have a great degree of confidence in the mediation process for its ability to help resolve log jams, allowing the school committee and the NTA to give a little, compromise a lot, and ultimately agree on a contract that is fair to our dedicated educators and fair to our students and residents by being one that we can sustainably afford. We will get to agreement. It will happen, although it may take some time and a lot of good faith effort and a collaboration to get there. While that process is taking its course, the superintendent and the administrative team have an obligation to ensure that student learning continues uninterrupted. Therefore, if there are disruptions that result in lost learning time for students or that reduce the number of school days below the 180 requirement, we will have to make up that time by extending the school year. We are still in a cycle of recovery from lost learning time during the pandemic, and our kids, for them, every day counts. Recently, we've seen strikes take place in other districts over contract stalemates. Thus, we must have contingency plans in place, communicated early, communicated often, so that if disruptions or strikes occur, we have anticipated the needs of our students and their families. We hope this contingency planning will ultimately be unnecessary. Putting hope aside, we still have to make plans. Anyway, we will discuss in greater detail a negotiations update later in this meeting. But for now, we will turn to public comment. So our public comment is a period reserved for members of the public to address the school committee and for the committee members to directly hear your concerns and perspectives. We do not respond in this context, but we listen and we seriously consider your feedback. Each of us is available by email or phone if anyone wishes to schedule a conversation. For those folks who are signed up tonight, when called, you'll be able to unmute, state your name, address, and take up to 3 minutes to share your concerns with this committee. Vice Chair Kathy Shields will give you a 30-second verbal warning before your time expires. And our first public commenter tonight is Jo Louise Allen, followed by Allison LeBron. Jo Louise, you appear to be muted.
Hi, I had to unmute, sorry. Can you hear me now?
Yes, please begin.
Yes.
State your name and address.
Yes, my name is Jo Louise Allen. I live at 24 Indiana Terrace in Newton, and I would like to discuss the elimination of the budget line item that was for understanding our differences, UOD. I believe that was done in haste, and without outreach to the community. After that line was changed to a new name, like some kind of disability awareness, the UOD just disappeared. The information from the interim superintendent is that she was going to convene a task force in order to evaluate other programs, not UOD, to introduce to the elementary schools in September. The task force, if it has been formed, it has not been related to the community. There is not an invitation, although we asked for it, for a representative from the CPAC to be on that task force. And we also questioned how in 12 weeks' time you could possibly vet a new program and have it ready to be, released, installed in September. And also, I just want to say that there are many programs in Newton that have been put on notice. They have had a year to be evaluated, be observed, program curricula, be reviewed again. And this program was brought up. I mean, it's been around for 45 years, but it was just mentioned in April or March of 2023. And by the end of April, it was gone. It was eliminated. I'm not going to review something that you already know, but I am going to state that I found documents beginning in 2015, 4 years before 2019, that dealt with high school start time. It took 4 years, many meetings, many surveys, many samplings, and it did not go into effect, the high school start time changes, until the fall of 2019. So there is a high school start time, which is not as important and valuable to our students as a disability awareness program that you spend 4 years on before implementation. And understanding our differences, whether the new administration chooses that is not the program for the elementary schools, or whether it chooses to include that program, there had not been a time, even 12 months or even 6 months, that was available, as I said, through surveys, through public meetings, any kind of vetting. And I don't know if my time's running out, but the last thing I would say is that—
Your time is up. Thank you so much,
Julie. Do I have any seconds or no?
No, your time is up.
Okay. You ignored the petition that had 2,400 signatures on it.
Thank you, Jo Louise. We appreciate your comment. Up next, we have Allison LeBron, followed by Bob Altshuler.
Hi, I'm Allison Lobron, and I live at 83 Fairway Drive in West Newton. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak to you today. I'm incredibly troubled by the events that have unfolded over the last 10 months during contract negotiations with the NTA. I want to speak specifically about the misleading letter that the school committee sent to the NPS community last Thursday. In that letter, it was stated, when a union management school committee team reaches an impasse, as we have now, school committees may file for mediation with the state. Many parents who received that letter assumed, as I believe was the intention, that there had been an impasse, that there was an impasse because the two sides couldn't or wouldn't bend enough to find middle ground. I understand that negotiations are contentious and that there are multiple perspectives. However, it feels inaccurate for the school committee to insinuate that we are at an impasse because neither side is willing to budge. Over the course of negotiations, the NTA's COLA proposal has come down 5 or 6 percentage points over 3 years, depending on the category, while the school committee's COLA proposal has barely gone up 0.5 percentage point in any category. One member of the negotiating team shared the following thoughts with us at a parent-educator collaborative meeting in early June, when the school committee bundled all of their proposals together in one package. It's, quote, "It seemed that up until last week we were inching along. It felt as if it was a dance. We were still dancing. Last week it changed dramatically. They told us we are entering a new phase, and they really were not lying. And so in addition to these totally unacceptable low cost of living offers, it was like they were saying, well, we can't pay what we don't have. Oh, and by the way, your working conditions are going to change in these 20 ways as well. It just felt really demoralizing." The same educator went on to say, "I went into this process with this vision that we wouldn't agree on everything, but school committee and NTA both want what's best for students, and we're going to find a way to make it happen." So my question for the school committee is, do you Do you really want what's best for our children? Our teachers want to preserve their planning time. They want a reasonable COLA. They want living wages for classroom aides. If you're not able to meet these very reasonable requests within the allocation the mayor has given you, then please publicly ask for more money. I understand that city finances are limited. However, budgets reflect priorities and values. This contract and this negotiation process says horrible things about our city's priorities and our values. To my fellow parents, please join me in
You have 30
actively supporting our
seconds.
educators. Find one of your 400 neighbors who has a fair contract sign on their lawn and ask them how you can get one too. We need to stand together and demand that the school committee delivers the contract that our educators and our students deserve. Thank you.
Thank you, Allison. Up next, we have Bob Altshuler, followed by Julie McLaughlin. I do, yep. Stephen here? Oh. Oh, okay. If not Bob, we'll go to Julie McLaughlin.
Pulling in Julie, I'm not sure what happened.
Okay. Thanks, Stephen.
Good afternoon. My name is Julie McLaughlin. I live at 56 Davis Avenue in West Newton and have children at Every Day and Newton North. Over the last 3 years, I've participated in the Parent Educator Collaborative as well, an organization established to give educators a voice in the district and better understand their experience working with our children. I've never been an educator myself, but I believe it's important to hear their unique perspective given their firsthand knowledge of the impacts of budget cuts, facility issues, curriculum changes, and social emotional challenges. I'm here today to also express my concern for how the school committee has conducted recent contract negotiations with the NCA and how our city expresses its value of Newton educators as a whole. I was alarmed to read last week's email from the school committee suggesting that NCA work stoppages would potentially require an extension of the school year. During our meetings, members of the negotiating team have provided updates throughout the process and never once suggested they were planning anything beyond the work to rule plan, which would not impact the calendar in any way and seems more than reasonable given the current obligations that go above and beyond their contracts. I saw the response from the NCA to clarify this representation, but have yet to see a correction issued by the school committee, its superintendent, or Mayor Fuller. Members of the negotiating team have shared with us their disappointment that the school committee has been unwilling to offer a competitive COLA in line with so many surrounding districts offering 10 to 15% over 3 years, especially given their significant increase in healthcare premiums. I've also heard concerns about reducing planning time, requiring increased coverage of classes and lunch duties, removing cap sizes for high school classes, and eliminating kindergarten aides. I understand in June your committee switched to a packaging of proposals which would not provide any opportunity for negotiating individual items. This decision, along with an inability to provide additional dates in August to continue discussion, suggests that the school committee was unwilling to even consider their concerns. I understand that this may be due to limited school funding given the failure to pass the recent override. However, it's deeply disturbing that we have allowed for funding to fall squarely on educators who have been working tirelessly since the pandemic began to support our students during an unprecedented period of social emotional concerns. I understand that there are currently close to 100 open positions. In the midst of a national teacher shortage, I fear that Newton will be unable to attract candidates and will lose some of our best educators to other districts who show they value them both in terms of compensation and participation. Mayor Fuller, I'm asking you once again to find the money to allow the school
You have
committee
30 seconds.
to provide a fair contract to its educators and our school system as a whole. Whether it comes from ARPA, free cash, or budget reallocation, we must continue to fully fund our schools and their dedicated employees.
Thank you, Julie. Up next, we have Bob Altshuler, followed by Jean Striel.
Mayor Fuller, members of the school committee, thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak today. My name is Robert Altshuler. I live at 95 Montrose Street in Newton. I am the lone ward parent representative on the Underwood Ward Task Force. I'm also a parent to rising second and fifth graders, and I'm also a graduate of the Newton Public Schools myself. I'm grateful for the excellent education that I received and the incredible teachers that I learned from. I'm grateful that my children have been benefiting from the same experience. I want to start by thanking Superintendent Nolan for hearing the concerns of the community and recommending that the task force's work stop and that a broader discussion about the vision for the long-term future of Newton Public Schools begins. As this discussion begins, I think it's important to remember where we are starting from and also where we're not starting from. It's not that we live in a community that had no particular plan for the future of its schools, or that suggestions to discuss closing schools got made in a transparent manner and with clear justifications during the course of the meetings of the Underwood Ward Task Force. Rather, this city with its 13 distinct villages is one that many of us chose to live in because of the excellent reputation of its public schools and because of its neighborhood elementary schools. We have a history of neighborhood schools, and when the current long-range plan for our schools was first being assembled about 10 years ago, the commitment to neighborhood schools was stated clearly. The areas around some of our elementary schools were relatively undeveloped when the schools were built, and over the last 75 to 100 years, the neighborhoods have literally been built up around these schools. Second, enrollment projections are one of the types of information that will certainly be informative in this process. In the course of my work with the task force and because of my professional background in data science, I identified a number of fundamental flaws in the methods that were being used by NPS to make enrollment projections. Several members of the community who also have expertise in statistics and I will be sharing more detailed information on this topic in the near future. But given the very limited time I have today, I will just say that the flaws are so severe that NPS's projections should only be used for planning for the immediate future and have no place in long-term planning. Accordingly, it is absolutely necessary to hire an independent third party to produce enrollment projections for time ranges that are relevant for this discussion. Although making accurate projections obviously gets more challenging as one looks further into the future, when the lifetime of our school buildings is 50 to 100 years, we must make the effort to produce reasonable projections that look farther into the future than just 10 years, that examine the long-term expectations for the number of students that will live in our city, taking into account existing housing stock and future development. Third, the fiscal challenges that Newton is facing at this moment may be the elephant in the room that can't be
You have
ignored.
30
The
seconds.
time range over which there are financial concerns is far exceeded by the time horizon when the city will be affected by the decisions about the future of our schools. This discussion should not be driven by what we can afford today or in the next 10 years. The discussion should be driven by what is best for our children and our community. And when the vision for the long-term future of Newton schools has started to take shape, then there will certainly be a time for a discussion of whether and how it can be afforded over the next 50 or 100 years. Finally, I can't stress enough the need for ample time for community participation in this process.
Your
Our
time
elementary
is up.
schools are the
Thank you
heart
so
of our
much,
neighborhoods
Rob.
around them and have shaped the neighborhoods for
Thank you.
generations. The decisions that will be
Stephen?
made about the future of our schools.
Bob, your time is up. Thank you very much for your comment. You can send the rest of your remarks to the school committee by email, and we will happy to see them in their entirety. Stephen, do you see Jean?
I don't.
Okay. So, thanks, Stephen. Thank you to everyone who spoke. We very much appreciate hearing your perspectives. Although public comment is not a vehicle for discussion or a thoughtful exchange of ideas, we have those all the time with members of our community. You will simply have to reach out and schedule a phone call with any one of us. So our public comment is now closed. And we'll turn to our consent agenda. For this, we have two items on the consent agenda. They are approval of policy EBC, Supplemental General Interim Policy for Emergencies. We had a first read during our last meeting, and the approval of a Newton South High School Athletic Hall of Fame one-day liquor license for October 21st. Is there a motion to, does anyone wish to remove an item from the consent agenda? Okay, is there a motion to accept the consent agenda? Thank you, Paul. Is there a second? Thank you, Rajiv. We have a motion and a second, and we'll now take a roll call vote by ward. Ward 1,
Yes.
Ward 2,
Yes.
Ward 3,
Yes.
Ward 4, yes, Ward 5,
Yes.
Ward 6,
Yes.
Ward 7,
Yes.
Ward 8,
Yes.
and Mayor Fuller is absent. Okay, thanks, everybody. Moving on, we have two items in our business agenda. The first is a discussion on Underwood and Ward. For that, I'm going to turn to our superintendent, Anna Nolan, for just to kick off the discussion, and then the school committee will have some discussion of our own.
Thank you, everyone. It's great to be here in the heat of the summer. And just when we can heat up on our long-term vision for the Newton Public Schools. So while this was formerly the Ward Underwood discussion, I think we are wise to kick open the title of this moment in our collaboration to be Next Steps in Long-Range Planning and Facilities Management. We have a subcommittee of the school committee which interacts with members of our staff and members of the city staff on the building side to talk about long-range planning. And that group was consulted, and I've read extensively the minutes and the products of the Ward Underwood Committee that has been terminated at this time. So the school committee has a memo before them, which we're fresh off our norms, so I'm not reading it to you. I'm just simply saying to the community that this memo does not put its finger on any solution for the future of the Newton schools in these areas at this time. What it seeks to do is ask and use all the really great questions that came from the Ward Underwood Committee, from members of the public, from our colleagues across the city, and from school committee members here, to try to condense all of the questions we have about this moment and our future forecasting for facilities and long-range planning. So our charge is that we need direction from the school committee to tell us what pieces of information do you need in order to give us a future charge that guides the development of a long-range plan for facilities management, enrollment, and student attendance. All of these things are in the works, committees to try to address these, but without your direction, we won't be able to move forward. And we saw a little bit of the outcome of that with the Ward Underwood Committee. So your long-range planning subcommittee of the school committee has recommended the following information to be needed. So an updated facilities condition report from a third-party consultant, a 10-year enrollment projection update from McKibben. I can tell you that all of the superintendents in the area just thought that was a delicious report that McKibben gave you last time around. We'd like to update that for guidance now. And then finally, directives from the school committee on how we would like to move ahead regarding neighborhood schools as a model. And I would say to you that while neighborhood schools is the base of the discussion, it does have resonances across what it means to have middle school configurations, grade configurations, and I've tried to put all of those questions that it triggers into this memo. I also just humbly offer to the school committee a way that I try to think about complex decisions in a human world, and that's a framework of examining the structural challenges before us, the human resource challenges, and the human challenges, which are often the heart challenges, the political challenges and the symbolic challenges that making any change or decision in this area might bump up on. So with that, I have given you many, many questions. I'm sure you have your own. The team and I are here to listen to what are the pieces of information that would inform you and allow you to direct us further.
So, committee members, I'm imagining you might need a minute to formulate your thoughts, and I think we'll take that moment, but the fact that the superintendent decided that we needed to take a step back and really have own a piece of this process that was foundational to the rest shouldn't surprise anyone. And so I guess the question to overlay on top of Anna's question is, how do we do that? As you bring your good suggestions and thoughtful suggestions here, keep in mind that there is no one way for us to tackle this and approach this. I think we should get to consensus about something that makes us feel that we've outlined a thorough process for the work that the school committee needs to do to shape, to articulate the vision that, again, will inform the strategic plan. And so I think I've filibustered enough, and I hope you've thought a little bit about this. We'll just do a spin around the table. Rajiv, would you like to offer anything up?
Yes, absolutely. I do think the approach of having a discussion around neighborhood schools is good. I certainly have a viewpoint on it, which I can share now or share later. The other issue, I think, also having been a part of the task force for as long as it existed, is that we may want to be very clear on three things. One is to have some level of agreement, either as a school committee or in a reformulated working group or task force. First, on the challenges and data, because there was a lot of back and forth about the validity of data elements and other things. Second, to be very clear on what the options are. And then third, for the school committee to look at those options and make a decision, having been presented those options by a working team. We, on the task force, I don't think got beyond the data. And a lot of it was based around disagreement on say, the estimates for enrollment. What there was agreement on was that the schools are in terrible condition, and I don't use that word loosely. These are both schools that are not in good shape. I was horrified to hear that we don't have sprinklers in these schools, that there are safety issues, that there are accessibility issues that really put them out of code 20 years ago that still haven't been addressed. So doing nothing is certainly not an option, and I feel like we need to get to agreement on that. We cannot continue to have our students in a situation where there is no plan to make improvements and put them in a better environment for learning. So given that doing nothing is not an option, we need to agree on what's going to drive the analysis of options in terms of what's viable, what works for the community, and above all, what works for our students, current and future. So I know that's a lot of high-level overarching thinking, but I think we will have a chance collectively to voice our specific opinions on the pros and cons of neighborhood schools and other issues that will factor into Ward and Underwood, but more broadly across Newton.
Thanks, Rajiv. Go ahead, Chris.
So I have some big picture thoughts, and then I've already sent to Anna an email with 15 or 16 discrete pieces of analysis that I think would be helpful in us thinking about this, many of which have several subparts to them. But big picture.
It was a good read.
Thank you. Big picture. So I think we have to keep in mind, number one, this is a big decision. This is one of the biggest decisions we'll come across in our time doing this. This is something that will literally outlive us all. And I think we need to think about, as we think about this concept of neighborhood schools and what it means, and, you know, by and large, we're talking about some concept of, you know, kind of community and connectedness and things like that versus some model of efficiency. That's really kind of what this boils. There's obviously a lot of nuance around that, but, you know, one of the things that made me do this is thinking about how for decades Newton has been able to thread this needle of having a community of almost 100,000 people and having the quality of academic experience that we do. We don't compare ourselves academically to other 100,000 people communities. We compare ourselves to generally much more homogeneous communities that are a quarter of our size. And we punch at their weight in terms of academic output. And is our neighborhood school model one piece of that special sauce? And I think that's something it's a very difficult question to answer, but I think that's one thing we have to keep in mind during this. And then, you know, as we talk about our notions of equity and every kid having what they need, how does that extend to our physical plant and infrastructure, where we don't have modern day learning spaces in some of these buildings. And, you know, we don't have basics of, you know, kitchens and cafeterias and things of that nature. And once we take the 4 schools that are on the books to be fully renovated of Countryside, Franklin, the next piece of Horace Mann and Lincoln Elliott, we will have a majority of our elementary students attending beautiful, brand new schools with all the bells and whistles. And in some sense, I think it's a different discussion when you're saying, man, you know what, those kids that were able to go to, you know, Ainger Cabot Zervis, and hey, they have these beautiful new buildings, lucky them, but you know, they're sort of the lucky ones. When that gets flipped to you have a majority of your students attending those buildings and a minority of your students attending buildings that are subpar. And by the way, if you include the Ward Underwood populations in there recognizing something's got to happen, we can't live in a steady state with those 2 buildings, it's well over 60% of our elementary students attending our brand new temples to learning. That's a more difficult proposition to say that's going to be our run rate for generations of students to come. And I don't know how we solve that problem. You know, I've often said, I think there's, you know, our next project maybe instead of one large building, you know, redo might have to be smaller projects to bring some of these other schools at least up to some level of, you know, basic service in the pursuit of saying we're really giving every kid what they need. So those are some of finally, and I know, Anna, you did include this in the memo, but this is not just our decision. We don't pay for these schools. We don't have the authority to go raise money to put a new school in. That's the city council. And for us to go through some lengthy process and then have our partners in city council say, you're out of your freaking minds, we should probably engage them up front in this process. I would strongly encourage that. So that's kind of my big picture thought. I can talk about some of the pieces of analysis. You let me know what shape you want the discussion to go.
Let's keep going with just those other folks, hearing from other folks, and then we'll back into a more detailed process part in a minute. Anping, do you have something to contribute?
Yeah. Thank you. Well, my 2 very able colleagues made a very good comments and overall picture and some specific question. And I love Chris' metaphor that whether the neighborhood school is special sauce for the past success. That's a good question. And also I'd like to acknowledge that Anna came to on board and raised this issue. It's very important, and I appreciate that those decision-making frameworks, and that help me particularly to expand my thinking process, and whether thinking about it from structure, human resources, political, and symbolic. Boy, that's quite a framework here to think about. And the reality we have to face is, you know, 100 years old schools, and as acknowledged that we have some state-of-the-art schools, and you know, at this moment, I think we own the those neighbors, the Ward and Underwood, you know, parents, especially Ward. I think we talked about this years ago, as people mentioned this, and we haven't resolved that issue yet. And this probably time. On the other hand, we have to recognize that it's a difficult process, and there are a lot of things to take into consideration. And I assume that quite a few people, know or heard of last century, 80s, I believe that when Newton structured significantly a school system due to the low enrollment, it was very painful. Very painful. We still feel that kind of pain even now when I met the neighborhood. residents and talk about this issue. So it was not easy, and but we have to think about the big picture. Again, the current situation when Newton School District is predicted to have a low enrollment for the upcoming decade. So that's a challenge here. And meanwhile, we want to maintain our high quality education reputation throughout the state. So it might take some time, but I think we all need to get involved and share the views, and hopefully we get some consensus. And I appreciate that we have this process to collect the feedback and working together, and hopefully we come up with some kind of well-defined and meaningful options for community to decide, for school community to decide, as well as for city council to deliberate, to come up with a final resolution that we can all accept. Thanks.
Thank you, Wan Ping. Emily? You wanna? Oh, I was going by ward.
Oh, sure. I'm happy to go. First and foremost, I'm on the long range facilities planning team, and I'm also was on the Ward Underwood team. And I am very happy that we paused the process in order to deliberate and have our discussions, as well as the 3 recommended steps that came from the long range facilities planning group. For multiple reasons, but I think the biggest one is that this is not just a Ward Underwood discussion and or decision, that this is a citywide discussion and decision, because what we decide here will have ramifications for many, many years to come. So that's one. I think I also wanted to mention, yes, City Council is important, but 5 out of the 7 buildings were decided by the voters of Newton. Not just by City Council, and I think that's an important thing for us to remember in terms of process and length of time and finances and where the financing is coming from. And of the recent elementary schools, 1 was fully done through debt service, straight direct debt service, which was Lincoln Elliott. Anyway, so yes, it is a much bigger pie and slice of the city that's going to have opinions and voices, and we as a committee have to listen to those as well and hear from the community. I think an outstanding question for me is what is the definition of a neighborhood school? Because I think if you ask people in the community, you'll get different answers depending on who you speak to. School committee went through a process similar to this back in 2007 and 2012/13 when the long range facilities plan was done by the outside consultants and then was updated before the override. Except we were in a very different situation at that point where we were bursting at the seams and our enrollment was very, very high. And so the discussion and the decision point that was made was, what's our maximum? Like, what's the biggest that we want our schools to be? What do those look like? What is our commitment to neighborhood schools when you've got, the potential of hundreds of kids? And the decision was made that, well, we'd like to have a cap theoretically of 500. And we are at a similar decision point, but coming in from the bottom. Where is our comfort in terms of lower enrollment numbers and embracing the neighborhood schools, but also ensuring that all our students have an excellent educational experience.
Thanks, Emily. Go ahead, Paul.
Thank you. Some wonderful comments. I know, as Emily, it's great to get the historical background because I think that's there are lessons there. It seems to me, that, Anna, I think your memo is excellent and outlines the questions beautifully. To me, one of the biggest questions is the one you have on page 2 or 3. Does a larger or smaller quantity of smaller elementary schools provide a measurable impact, positive or negative, to the educational benefit of the students? there seems to be I don't want to use the word in a pejorative way, a prejudice on the part of state officials in the state building authority that schools should be of a certain larger size. I don't think that should be determinative for us, in that the likelihood that state funding would be available for any new schools in Newton for the next decade or perhaps more, given the demand in Somerville and in Boston and elsewhere, is likely to be fairly high, and therefore it will be locally funded. And as Emily properly points out, it will be a decision of the voters, likely, not just the city council, but certainly there's going to be some kind of referendum on many of those. So it seems to me question number one is, in terms of delivery of educational services, is there something to be gained or lost from different sizes of schools? And for that, I imagine we can look across the country. I imagine there's a wide variety of school sizes and results across the country, and maybe that can help inform us. So that's my first thought. Second thought, another question you raise, Anna, is how confident can we be in the enrollment projections in the short, medium, and long term? And for this, I remember back to when my first daughter was in utero in 1978, and a gentleman named Vincent Saluzio, who worked for Mayor Mann, made projections about enrollment in the Newton Public Schools, and the result of those projections were closing of Warren Junior High School, Weeks Junior High School, Hyde Elementary School, Emerson Elementary School, Hawthorne Elementary School. And just a few years later, and I remember calling the mayor's office saying at that time, hey, there's a group of us who are about to have children. Maybe you haven't counted them yet because they're not quite visible. And sure enough, a few years later, we needed a new middle school. And the only site that seemed to be available was the Solomon Schechter School, which is now the Oak Hill Middle School, right next to the Brown Middle School. So now we have the MBTA Communities Act, and we have a new zoning proposal before the City Council, which reportedly would add the potential for 10,000 new dwelling units in Newton. Now, some of them may not be adjacent to Ward and Underwood, but there are secondary effects of new housing in Newton Center and Newton Highlands and the like that are, according to the Attorney General, required for us to allow. Now, that development doesn't happen right away, but the schools are going to be here for a long time. So I think that's a really pertinent question. The one question, and I've told Anna this, that on which I quibble a bit among her list, is the one about what is the impact on residential property values and neighborhood connections if a neighborhood school closes. I don't think that's jurisdictional to us, that question. It's obviously of interest to the city as a whole, but I don't think we should spend our resources trying to answer that question. One, because it's not jurisdictional. I also don't think it, as a city planner, I don't think it can be accurately modeled. I think given all the other determinants of property values, the changes in zoning are going to overwhelm the likely impact of a school closing. I guess you could go back and see what the property value impact was of all the closings that I mentioned before. As I look on my street, which is adjacent to Weeks Middle School, there doesn't seem to be any negative impact on property values a few years later. Likewise, the issue of neighborhood connections is really hard to measure after the fact. I guess we could interview the people who used to live around Hyde and Hawthorne and the like to see how they feel about the neighborhood, but many of them are gone at this point. So I don't think that's measurable, and again, I don't think that's jurisdictional to us. It's a bigger city issue, but I don't think it's jurisdictional to us. Anyway, I think these are great questions. We'll get back to process, I think, afterwards to make it right.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Paul. Go ahead, Kathy.
Thanks. So I'm going to try not to repeat what my colleagues have said, because I think a number of you have made very interesting and important points with which I agree. As a member of the ward community for the last, 11 or so years, I mean, this is clearly something that people have been concerned about and worried about for a long time. And I think there is, I have conflicting thoughts about both the term and our understanding of what it means to have a neighborhood school. I mean, I think there is undeniably, within the geographic proximity of each of our schools, a sense of community and neighborhood. But I also know that from going through our student assignment working group, and because school boundaries change over time, I think individual families' sense of neighborhood and community is where their children go to school, whether it's 3 blocks away or 10 blocks away. And I feel like there is both an important aspect to what it means to go to your quote-unquote neighborhood school, and an aspect of that is very much formed by the group of families your kids know and that you as a resulting parent know. And that those things change over time. Like when we change school boundaries and a home switches from one school district to another, I don't think that resulting family feels that all of a sudden they've lost their neighborhood school because they're going to a different school. So I think when I think about our long-term planning process, the lens I use to think about these schools are schools that are capable of having only 2 sections versus per grade, versus schools that are capable of having 3 or more. And both Ward and Underwood clearly fall into these might be able to have a grade or 2 at 3 sections, but they cannot hold 3 sections per grade. That's not how they were built. That's not their capacity. And I think we learned as a result of the Ward Underwood task force that you can't really add on to either of those schools in a meaningful way without making immense changes to both buildings that may or may not be feasible. So I don't really think that that's something we are looking at with any reasonableness. And I think we also heard from the educators as part of that process about their perceptions of the value of having larger cohorts for the students. I think that's something we as a group need more information about, and I would like to hear more about, because I really think those educational impacts of whether you're talking about 2 section schools or 3 or more section schools should be a big part of the decision we make, because that's really our charge, I think, is to provide the structure for the best educational model for our kids. And so I think that's something we need to talk about and think about a lot more. I do think that it would be very useful to have the demographer come back and update their findings, taking into account all of the competing things. On one side, we have the MBTA communities law. On the other side, we have declining birth rates and expectations of declining birth rates. But I think at the end of the day, if what we are talking about is building schools that last 50 to 100 years, I think we all have to get comfortable with the fact that populations are going to go up and down over that 50 and 100 years. And we don't know, and there is no way we can know right now, how they will go up and down and with any precision in which decade. I think all we can say is that we're fairly certain that there will be changes in our population in town over the next 100 years. There have been changes in our town significantly over the last 100 years when these schools were built. And I don't think we can get ourselves too mired in the details of, is this district projected to have 40 or 50 kids a year? I just don't think that's where we should be spending our energy, because those things are unknowable beyond the next 5, maybe to 10 years. I think the other sort of big picture thought I have is that, and this is sort of going back to something Chris said, I think the update to our district-wide facilities conditions is very important, because it sort of goes to that idea of, can you make improvements at the other not new schools that change important things about the educational offerings we're able to provide, or make meaningful cosmetic updates without having to do projects that make it essentially that you're replacing the school. Because I know that there are some kinds of changes that you make that if you make a series of changes, you then have to make additional changes as well. And I would want to know before we go down that road whether that's even feasible, or whether to make any meaningful changes you're talking about replacing those schools. And I think the facility analysis report would be able to give us that information.
Thanks, Kathy. Go ahead, Cove. If you'd like.
So my kids went to a neighborhood school in Newton. They could walk there. Friends from their neighborhood lived there, all went there. And they could also take the bus, which was also nice. But they didn't go to, because they went to Memorial Spalding. I live in Oakville Park. They did not go to the original neighborhood school that was built for our neighborhood. And while, when I reflect on that, it would have been nice to literally look out my window and see them on the playground. I think that, when I think about the perspective that we need to have when we look at these, I don't feel that we're actually discussing right now getting rid of neighborhood schools. I think it's the scale of how close in the neighborhood and what we have. To me, not having neighborhood schools means that there would be some sort of a lottery that we would assign kids to, and they could choose a school in Newton. I think we should remain committed to neighborhood schools. I think that the fact is that we don't have to define that neighborhood school as what was originally there. So I think that's my first point, and I know it's really difficult, and I think it's really difficult for parents in the immediate community of these schools to feel the loss of that. And I think it's also really difficult for parents, especially in elementary school, to have a perspective on what other schools look like, what other schools are capable of, because they may or may not have that perspective. So I think that that making sure we keep an open mind about some of these things, and I feel we definitely shouldn't give up on neighborhood schools. I think that also, getting more information, like Kathy suggested, about the educational benefits of having more of a cohort in your school. And again, I don't feel like we're talking about really large schools versus really small schools. I think we're talking about gradations on there, and I think that there is a critical mass that makes sense. And I can think of examples in my own kids' lives where sometimes kids need to be separated, and when there's no other options, when that cohort is just together for 6 years, there can be some detriment to that as well. So I think lastly, I think we do need to make sure, and I also hear what Kathy says, that there's no perfect population enrollment report that we can have, but I do think that we need to make sure that we have the best that we can, and that we have the trust of the community in what we're using to base our decisions on.
Thank you, Cove. So we've done a little twirl around the table. I will share my thoughts now, but I think afterward we'll just do a high-level overview, of a process to, over the next year, how we're going to do this. Who should be involved? Who do we tap to assist? Whether the folks we tap to assist should be sitting in the meetings, or we invite them into the meetings. Those are the types of things I'm looking for, and I think we kind of tee up now, and we'll work with more specificity throughout, okay? So my thoughts are, Cove kind of landed where I started. And for me, it's this idea of neighborhood schools and how we define them. I think there's a temptation to have our small Venn diagram idea of a neighborhood school. It's the place I walk to with my kids. It's a block and a half away. I can see it from my house, or whatever it is that gives you that feeling of neighborhood. I think we need to broaden that, because the reality of our district is one person's definition of a neighborhood might not comport with what we need in terms of flexibility as a district. And those flexible needs are variable based on financial constraints or educational best practices or you name it, or objective factors of how a state process or state board like the MSBA views our neighborhood school model. There's so many things that we need to kind of keep aware of and factor in. And so I don't think we exclude at this point. We can't really exclude anything. I would urge us to not do that. I would urge us to just have a scraping for information, the information that Anna, you and your team have articulated, the analysis of the buildings, excluding the projects that are already in the pipeline. That's great. The McKibben report to update demographics post-pandemic. That's also great. From there, we'll have to figure out what our piece looks like. And so, turning to process, if anyone would like to just kind of give their high-level suggestion for what we should be doing in terms of a process, let's hear it, and we'll just do a show of hands. Go
May I
ahead,
ask
Anna.
a question?
Yes.
So just in your remarks, perhaps address what you see as the role of your existing subcommittee of this group, because that could be a clearinghouse for helping the administration to work through whatever you need next. So just
You mean of the long-term
the
planning
long-term
committee?
planning committee, you already have a standing subcommittee, and they already volunteered to be involved in this, so.
So for clarity's sake, long-term planning committee members, raise your hand. Myself, Emily, Anping, I was waiting for you to raise, are all on the long-term planning committee working with Liam and Stephanie Gilman and other folks that we pull in from time to time. So, all right, question, or raise hands if you have a process suggestion. Otherwise, we will come back and revisit this relatively soon. Go ahead, Paul.
This is really in the nature of a first cut at that. I think Anna has properly and appropriately outlined the questions. And it seems to me probably most of the work would require some outside help. I don't think your staff would have the time to do all this, I imagine, but, and I think a possible next step is to refine the questions, engage one or more types of consultants to do the work, to answer the questions, where our existing subcommittee oversees that process, but where interested members of the community are presented with the results as they come out so the community can be informed. Seems to me that's kind of the logical next step that I see. But there's a lot of work there, and frankly, I don't see it as possible within 6 months even to do all that. I may be overestimating, but it seems to be a many month process.
Yes, over the course of the year for sure, but one of the initial questions that we had when we discussed was, what are the time constraints that we're working within?
Yeah.
We're still trying to get a handle on that.
That's a good
But,
question.
Yeah, thanks, Paul. Go ahead, Kathy.
I mean, I think if it's the case that we are going to have the demographer update the demographic numbers and get an updated facility conditions report, I think the first thing we need is a budget estimate for those and to have a discussion about how that fits into our existing budget.
I just
I would
wrote that down.
imagine
Yeah,
that
forecast the
could come.
cost. Yeah, that could impact how this happens.
Yeah.
Chris?
So I feel like as we have had this discussion and, you know, as this is really going on over a couple of years, you know, we keep talking about this in the context of the current situation, and we are not taking that very long-term view. Again, recognizing these buildings will be standing when we are no longer standing. So, you know, I think as we think about the enrollment analysis and demographic analysis and things like that, you know, we've got to take a to the extent possible, a very long look back. And, you know, we've heard incessantly about declining birth rates and how that's impacting our enrollment. And, well, we've gone through several cycles of, you know, declining and expanding birth rates over the last 100 years. How did that impact the enrollment of the schools going back through time? And I would say relative to the housing stock, because to be honest, I mean, if I think about Ward and Underwood, probably the thing that has been most constant in those neighborhoods over the last 100 years is the housing stock. And to the extent you have declining birth rates, but you have 4 and 5 bedroom homes, I'm not sure that a declining birth rate has, you know, on a national or state level or whatever, has all that much impact on how many families with 2 or 3 kids are going to be living in those homes. And particularly since, at least in the research I've done, you know, that declining birth rate is driven more by, you know, a cohort of women never choosing to have children than by family size shrinking for those who choose to have families. So the number of 2 and 3, 4 children families is actually not declining. And that's who fills those homes, and that's who's going to be the population to fill those schools. So there's those, I mean, that's just one example, and one of the things I sent to Anna. But those are the types of, I think, you know, below the surface depth we have to get on really thinking about these things. You know, I mean, there's the informational piece, and I think we need to lay out upfront very clearly and get it on paper. These are the analysis that we want to see. I think, honestly, I'm not sure another working group in the way we put one together for Ward and Underwood is productive. I don't think that's necessarily necessary. That doesn't mean we don't want a lot of community input and do a lot of outreach to get that community input. And I think we have to schedule that out very clearly and make sure that, you know, there are ample opportunities for, you know, multiple voices to be heard. I just don't know that I don't know what function a administrator, parent working group is going to have in sort of processing that information. And that might just be you know, it could be an unproductive step, not a productive step. So, you know, I guess that's how, you know, I think step one is defining what we need very, very clearly so that there's no misinterpretation of that. Setting out a schedule of the community output. I mean, as I just think through this, I mean, I'm kind of agreeing with Paul. This sounds like a year-long process to me.
Thanks, Chris. Go ahead, Anna, and then Rajiv.
I just want to also just firmly come out and say this from the meeting number 1, that I will be continuing to raise to you the prospect of opening school choice as a district school choice. I mean, we are in a crouching stance with our teachers union because we are in a strapped financial situation, and our teachers are our most valuable asset. And if we could give, we would give. And we are also then weighing this facilities and management costs, which, depending on which tact we take, has additional costs that may be borne fully by the taxpayer. So, you know, I'm just trying to read the landscape based on the override conditions, the situation we're in with bargaining, et cetera. So I just want to raise school choice from this very first meeting as something that we just need to consider that might help us in a short-term strategy while we try to develop a longer range one. And at the same time, whenever you think it's best to do it, we must get out to the community and hear from them directly about what they mean by neighborhood schools and what their priorities are for the vision of elementary education in this district. Because we certainly are at our best when we're representing all the viewpoints of the community, but we really need to do some FaceTime on this fundamental issue. So I'm happy to lead the roadshow, and we come together and we ask the questions that we feel will best help you make decisions down the road. I think it's a critical part, and I just want to make sure we do that FaceTime with each sector of Newton.
Thank you, Anna. Go ahead, Rajiv.
in terms of neighborhood schools, one thing I want to make sure we all know is that neighborhood schools in Newton don't necessarily imply that your kids can walk there. We have a lot of families whose kids go to their neighborhood schools on a bus or a van, or have to have parents drop them off or walk them there. So it's not necessarily linked to being within walking distance of a school. That's fantastic. But your child is not necessarily going to walk or roll to school if it's beyond a certain distance. So that's something we need to be comfortable with. And I think many parents understand that, perhaps the whole community does not. But there's this impression that you need to be able to see the school or be within 3 blocks or something, but that's absolutely not the reality right now in Newton. I also think, based on our discussion right now, one of the key questions is, what's the scale of our schools? So there's the upper limit, what's the lower limit? We heard from a number of educators during task force meetings that having 3 sections really assists with having specials, with being able to offer languages, with being able to offer more cultural, culture and arts teaching, etc. We need to validate that, right? I think we've certainly heard it, that when you get beyond or below a certain level of scale, it's more difficult to provide some of these opportunities that our students absolutely deserve. So what are the lower and higher bounds for the size of our schools? We also don't want them too big. It's harder to manage, and unless you're centralizing, which we're not talking about right now, we don't want mega elementary schools with 1,000 students. It's not the scale our city is at right now, really. Because this is my opinion. One thing that I think I heard a little bit of from others, but I'd like to say very clearly, I think the enrollment analysis is a bit of a red herring. Beyond a certain point, we can just do a straight line that says, here's what the enrollment will look like 10 years from now. There are a lot of unknowns. In the past, despite thorough and well-intentioned analyses, going back to Paul's early years as a parent, we've had over-enrollment and under-enrollment as compared to the analyses. We should build the right scale schools, make sure they're in a place that makes sense to the extent that there is any flexibility with where you put them, adjust with the student assignments, to whatever demographic changes there might be. And it's a bit of a moving target, but we're building for the long term. So the idea of us trying to look at 5 and 10 year enrollment estimates, I think doesn't make much sense. Let's assume that 10, 15 years from now, we're looking at a lot more housing stock. Let's think critically about birth rates, because the number of students in Newton depends on the number of housing units we have and the type of housing units we have. We don't have a lot of empty housing in Newton. So if it's built, if it goes from a 1-family to a 2-family, it gets filled. That's what drives it. And we can do all kinds of other analyses, and we do, but the real determinant is how many homes, what types of homes, are they going to be affordable for young families? And if they are, young families will move there. So we can simplify some of the analysis. It does not simplify the actual options and decision making. Like this is a difficult decision specific to Ward and Underwood. No decision that's made is going to have everyone happy, and that's a tough thing to acknowledge, but I think we need to acknowledge that. Our role is to try and help get to as good a decision as possible.
Thanks, Rajiv. So I think working through the long-range planning group and our docket meetings, we'll be able to put on on the calendar a few meetings where we're checking in on this issue, and we're getting some details about budget estimates, and we're overlaying some desired community engagement processes. I think we'll stop this conversation for now, but as I said, work with the docketing group, with the long-range planning group, and with Anna and her team, and just put in our calendar some additional times to talk about this. And in the meantime, if you have really good suggestions, send them to Anna, as we, in our community agreement, send them to Anna and CC me, and that way we'll make sure that we're able to, tee up those for future conversations. Chris, go ahead.
Can I just ask, what are you thinking in terms of, at least a next step then to getting to a plan? We just had this sort of very big, here's some things we're thinking about, but, I don't know, I guess I don't feel great with the the information will come out when it comes out kind of thing. Can we at least have a step to a next step?
Yep, go ahead, Anna, and then I'll...
Let me try to take a stab at that. So here's what I think I heard from you all today, and then I'll just tell you the next step. So here's more information that is not in the questions in the memo. So one, we're going to need to use the long-range subcommittee to interact with administration and pull in city partners to bring back information that's needed. So that sort of constitutes a first step for me to triage what has been requested here and cost it out. And then I think I can give you a timeline of how those might be approached. The additional information that you said you wanted was what was included here, but also something about how walkable are our schools right now. I think that's something that's, and I need to figure that out anyway, because there's a lot of, I had a lot of questions at a recent barbecue just about walkability, so I'm gonna do that anyway. So it sounds like just an assessment of how walkable are our schools right now might help us get to what it means to be a neighborhood school. The scale, the upper and lower limit of sections we desire as a school system in our elementary schools, and a system for getting that information. We may just have to ask how people define neighborhood schools in their minds. We may just have to ask that. Good thing we have Thought Exchange, that's what it's for. We have to understand the MBTA zoning impact on affordable housing, but also on, what that may mean for residential impacts. Having gone through this in another district, the long and short, at least in Metro West that we did, was there was no way to determine when you close or open a school, whether what's equally important is what you do with that empty facility. So empty facilities are not desirable because they can be bought up for certain things that may be undesirable. So it's more important then for us to also ask, what is our retirement of facility option versus warehousing of buildings and repurposing, and how does that work? I think we owe all the neighborhoods that conversation so they know what's to expect. A request to hear from educators on valuing larger cohorts for children. We want to hear more from them. The demographer update is needed just to square with declining birth rates, and also some sort of indication of how MSBA is working right now. Now, my experience is they don't go on the record about a lot of these things, but is there a sweet spot of facility portfolios that they have in mind for us that we don't know about? Updated facilities condition report to try to determine educational benefits of the larger cohort versus a smaller cohort. My own personal research indicates that class size is generally studied. School size is not well studied, but I'll recreate that research for you. And so with that, I think it's refine and prioritize the questions, meet with the team in the long-range planning committee, come to you with potential consultant engagement with costs, book it across the year when we'll say we will talk to the community about it, but we need a specific community engagement plan that will ask these questions that we have, and a clear priority for the data sets we will deliver, which I'll extract from what I heard today. From there, I think we revisit the decision-making matrix that the Ward Underwood Committee put together, and we will have to prioritize items on there and weigh them so that you have some sort of framework for making decisions. I'll bring up my frames again, because you are going to have to talk about things like heart and the soul of neighborhoods and what people, there's an emotional component to this that cannot be undersold. So we want to hear about that so it doesn't burst all over the entire process. So I think that's the timeline for now. It's not a 3-month thing that I can tell while we're doing a few other things on the side. So if that works, I'll get back to the team and create a timeline for you.
I think that's a good start. And the only thing I would add is what I was articulating before, Chris, was just the process by which we bring back a more fleshed out, more detailed timeline for deliverables, many of which Anna just articulated. And so I think we don't have another summer meeting scheduled, but one of our very first meetings when we are in our regular meeting cadence in the fall will be to lay out that process with the cost estimates and who will do different pieces of this work at which times, and then having placeholders for the school committee to analyze those, the everything that we're gathering, all the information. You want to say something else? Go ahead.
Yeah, can I just make one request since, the superintendent brought it up? In terms of school choice, could we possibly get like a 1-2 page just primer? I mean, I'd be lying if I said I knew all the rules and mechanics and logistics of school choice. I think that would be really helpful for us if that's going to be something that we'll inject into part of this discussion of, economically, logistically, how the whole program lays out under state law.
Yep. So on the last page of the memo for this meeting, I did include a link to interdistrict school choice and the rules of engagement there. I can tell you how it works, like as a school administrator who has been in a school choice district. So we can bring that back. This is the 2-page overview there for you.
Perfect.
Yep.
That'd be great. Thank you.
All set? All right. Well, thank you very much. It's not I heard 3 months. It's not a 3-month project. It is a year-long, very detailed, very, one that requires a lot of community engagement, a lot of community feedback, and a lot of thought and effort on our part as well, and the staff. So we will do that work and revisit this periodically. Up next, we have a negotiations update, and our lead negotiator and vice chair, Kathy Shields, will walk us through the update. Stephen, I'm not quite sure, do you have the memo? If so.
I do not.
Okay. Go ahead, Kathy. Stephen, I'm going to email it to you, and if you could post it towards the end, that would be great.
Great.
So we're providing another one of the periodic updates we've been providing all year on collective bargaining. As I think all of you who've been listening to our prior updates know, we started negotiating with the NTA back in October. We've been negotiating for about 10 months. We have had 16 collective bargaining sessions. And in those bargaining sessions, both parties have made a number of proposals, have responded by making counter proposals. More recently, the school committee has been making package proposals, and the NTA did in our last bargaining session as well, or actually maybe even the bargaining session before that. The reason that we moved to package proposals is because a contract is a package. It's an agreement between the parties that involves a number of both financial matters, describes a number of aspects of working conditions, describes a number of benefits, and each of those provisions has a cost associated with it. And so it is almost nonsensical to think about pieces of a contract in isolation. Instead, we need to look at all of those pieces together and how they impact each other in determining what the sides can afford to do. So that's the reason we moved to package proposals. It was in the interests of trying as hard as we could to get a contract as quickly as we could. We have, over the last 10 months, reached what we call tentative agreements, or areas in which we agree as parts of packages that we agree with the NTA on making certain kinds of changes to the contract. The memo has a list of those areas. They include things like increasing tuition reimbursement for educators, enhancing parental leave benefits, enhancing or providing avenues for increasing pay for our substitute teachers, for our paraprofessionals, for paying teachers who substitute teach classes at the middle and high school for other absent teachers. And that's actually something the school committee is particularly interested in. It was a great suggestion by the NTA. It's going to be able to help us reduce the number of canceled classes for students, assuming that we're able to reach an ultimate agreement. So we have made a lot of progress in the last 10 months. Where we remain very, very far apart is with what is arguably one of the key issues that remains, that divides us, and that is the rate of pay increases for our staff. I think, as a number of you know, the last couple of budget cycles have been very hard. We've had to cut positions in each of those years, and that's not good for the district, it's not good for our students, it's not good for our educators. And so one of the school committee's overarching goals in this contract is to reach financial sustainability. We don't want to agree to a contract that we can't afford. And for us, what that means is living within the 3.5% allocation that we have from the city. We can't be agreeing to a contract that's going to grow at the rate of over 3.5% and assume that we're not going to be dealing with those kinds of budget cuts year after year. So I'd like to address one of the things we've heard in response to our communications lately, and that is, well, the NTA has moved a lot in their package proposals, or at least in terms of their proposals with respect to cost of living adjustments, and the school committee hasn't. So what do you say to that? Well, I guess I would say two things, which is that the school committee has moved in a number of its proposals that have significant financial impacts. We may not have changed our COLA percentages that we're offering, but we have changed other provisions of the contract that we're willing to agree to that have financial impacts of hundreds of thousands of dollars. So you need to look at the package and not just one aspect of the package to understand the financial implications of it. The other thing I would say is that the school committee started in a very different place from the NTA. We started with COLA percentages that we could afford and that were comparable to where we have been in the past. In contrast, the NTA started with COLA demands that were very, very high, that would require year-over-year increases in the NPS budget that are nothing like the NPS budget increases that it has ever gotten. I know I've told you before that we're expecting a 3.5 increase in our allocation percentages. The increases that the NTA requested would require 10% or more annual growth, and that's just not something that is reasonable. So to the extent they have moved more, it's because where they started was much higher. Some of the other things that I think it's important to provide in this update is a little bit more discussion about where we are now. For the last couple of collective bargaining sessions, both the school committee team and the NTA team have agreed that we're stuck on this major issue of cost of living increases for our staff and in compensation issues generally. As a result of that condition of being stuck, the school committee asked the union to agree that we're at impasse And what that means is that it would involve a state mediator into our process to try to help us reach an agreement. The mediation process is set forth very clearly in state law. It's not an adversarial process. Instead, it brings in someone whose expertise is in helping parties reach agreement to work with both sides as part of a formal process to try to help us reach an agreement. That's what these folks do, and these processes are almost always successful. So in moving to mediation, we are not trying to harm the NTA in any way. We're not being adversarial. We're simply recognizing that we're stuck and we need outside assistance to try to help us reach an agreement. So the school committee made that request to the state DLR, the Department of Labor Relations, last week. We understand that the NTA has made a filing that says we're not at impasse, please don't send us to mediation quite yet. So we've sort of talked with the DLR and with our council about what's likely to happen next. Under the current DLR, it may be that they say to us and to the NTA, go back and have another session or two and then come back to us before we appoint a mediator. We'll see what they say, and that's fine if that happens. But we do think that the addition of a mediator to our sessions will help us get to agreement more quickly and more efficiently. The other thing that I think it's important for you to know a little bit more about is that the NTA's communications have threatened work stoppages, and that's something that we're particularly concerned about. Those work stoppages take the form of the instruction or the request from the NTA that its teachers engage in silent meetings, and these are meetings where collaboration is essential, and have asked their administrative members to organize meetings such that input or interaction would not be required. And that's a very different kind of meeting that produces very different kinds of results than a collaborative meeting where people exchange their ideas. The school committee believes that these are work stoppages, that they are not permitted under the state law, and that is the basis, or part of the basis, of the communication that we sent out last week. We also need to let the community know that teachers, a number of teachers who had signed up for paid professional development opportunities this summer that would help us advance and launch our new reading curriculum in the elementary grades, have pulled out of those opportunities that they signed up for. And that's going to have an impact on how we can launch that curriculum successfully and promptly. These are all things that the school committee is particularly concerned about. And we also want to make sure that we're upfront with the parent community about the impact that work stoppages and any strike actions might have on the school year next year. We are not trying to be alarmist. We certainly hope that these actions will not happen and that there will be no disruptions. But we think it's our obligation to let you know that that possibility exists and that we're taking steps now to plan for what will happen to ensure to the greatest extent possible that students' learning is not interrupted. The other thing I want to talk about a little bit, and we've talked about this in the past, is a little bit more detail about what the financial compensation that we've offered as part of this contract negotiation is. About half of our teaching staff, our Unit A NTA members, get both step increases and cost of living increases. And so we've provided on the school committee's website and in this memo samples of the kinds of salary increases that we've offered. And you can see how these salary increases would impact both a classroom teacher who's on step 5 of our salary chart and one of our paraprofessionals who's on step 3 of our salary chart. And over the 3 years of the contract, what we've proposed would result in a cumulative increase of about $13,000, or annual increases between 5.1 and 6.7%. for that classroom teacher. On the paraprofessional side, the annual percentage increase is a little higher, between 7.6 and 7.8% annual increases. We also have updated some of the salary comparisons between Newton and other districts. Earlier in the school year, we gave you data from fiscal year '22. We've now gone and collected updated data that's become available for fiscal year 2023. Steve, if you can scroll down to the attachment to the memo, it's the next page after that. So these tables, and I'm not going to read them to you in detail, but this shows that for fiscal year 2023, as other districts settled contracts for 2023, Newton's position remained unchanged in most of these categories. We either moved up one rank or down one rank in all of these categories. So when you look at fiscal year 23 data, even as other districts have begun to settle their 23 contracts, we maintain a very, very competitive salary when considering what surrounding and comparable districts are paying their educators. So with that, I'm willing to answer any questions you folks have.
Thank you, Kathy. Really excellent summary of our current status. Questions from the members? Anything you've heard from folks that you'd like to address here, or question for the team? Myself, Kathy, and Paul, we happy to respond. Oh, go ahead, Rajiv.
When do we expect to hear back from DLR about next steps?
I don't know that we know for sure. I would expect that we'll hear something within the next week. Either here's your mediator, or we want you to go back and try again once more, and then we'll give you a mediator.
And I think as Kathy said, when she gave her update, we are fine with either result. Either a mediator is assigned, or we will go back and sit down and keep working at the contract negotiations. We've been working in good faith. We are fully intending to continue working in good faith, either with the assistance of a mediator or just the parties sitting down and working coincidentally in this room and just working at the contract. So, other questions? Right. All right. Well, actually, I have one that I was out and about in the community this week, talking with folks, and some of our parents and guardians were wondering whether we knew when the disruptions might impact the school year. Would you like to respond to that?
Sure, and I think the answer is we don't know, and we certainly hope that there won't be any disruptions to the school year. We hope that we're able to reach a contract, but to some extent that's out of the school committee's control and in the hands of what the NTA decides to do.
Great. Thank you, Kathy. So we are working to put together a frequently asked question document that'll be uploaded on the website, on the web page, the negotiations page of the NPS website. And we are committing to giving information frequently, accurate information, and we're also available for email or phone if anyone would like to schedule a conversation or a follow-up discussion. So, thank you.
This memo will also, there's a negotiations tab on the school committee webpage. We'll add this memo to the other memos that are there.
Perfect. All right, thank you so much, Kathy. And with that, we have concluded our posted business for tonight's meeting. Thanks to everyone who attended and to our staff for detailed and really good reports and updates, and working with our new superintendent to generate those. We appreciate it, and our meeting is now adjourned. Have a good night, everyone. Continue to enjoy summer.